Our speaker today is David Karowe, Dr. David Karowe. His topic is polar bear birds and oak trees. How will climate change impact non-human migration? Uh, Dr. Karowe is a professor of biological sciences at Western. He got his bachelor in biology from Harvard and his PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from U of M. He teaches courses about the causes and consequences of climate change, conducts research on the effects of rising atmospheric CO2 on plants and higher levels in the food chain, and for over 3 decades directed national undergraduate and graduate training programs in climate change at the U of M Biological Station. Over the course of his career, Dr. Karowe has received numerous grants from the National Science Foundation, U.S. Department of Agriculture, and Department of Defense in support of climate change research and training. He has also published many scientific papers, given over 150 public climate change talks, and received several teaching awards. Go for it.
Thank you, Nikki. Since he is someone well known to most or all people on this Zoom, I just want to mention that the research training programs, undergrad and grad, that I was involved in up at the biostation, Steve Bertman was also involved in. So it was a cool collaborative effort. Okay, so we know that climate change is going to put a lot of people on the move. It's going to displace a lot of people through coastal flooding, through drought, agricultural failures, almost certainly through conflict. But we don't necessarily think that much about what's going to happen to non-human species. They are also going to be affected. They are also going to have to move. Some of them will be able to move fast enough. Most will not. And they may be confused about the direction that they should be going in. So we'll take a look at what's been happening so far with non-human migration that's arising because of climate change, and also look into the future if we can, as much as we can. Okay, I almost always find a way to work this video into my talks. This, I think, is the best way to visualize how much climate change has already happened. This is a video of the record of temperature change all over the planet since 1880, put together by NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies. And the way to read this is every color represents, at the time shown on the timeline here, the temperature of that location relative to the average temperature of the same location during the reference period, 1950 to 1980. So let's just see what's been happening with temperature, the most important part of climate on our planet. And of course, 2024 was the warmest year in the thermometer record, beating out the second place was 2023. So we're clearly on a planet where the main component of climate, temperature, is changing dramatically. And we would think that that means that some places that were suitable habitat for a species 50 years ago may not be anymore, and they are faced with a challenging situation for which they have relatively few options. So let's ask, what options do non-human species have for surviving rapidly changing climate? First is stay where you are. Stay in your current habitat and adapt to climate change. And in the natural world, with reference to the natural world, adapt means evolve. Let natural selection run its course and provide you the ability to deal with the new climate without you having to move. So it's evolve, don't migrate. We'll talk a little about this. It's not the subject of the talk, but it is worth mentioning that staying in place and evolving is almost certainly going to be impossible for most animals, plants, fungi, because the pace of climate change is just way too fast for genetic adaptation for most species, maybe not for bacteria. Okay, the second option is move to a new suitable habitat, and that's going to be the focus of this talk. We will call that being a climate migrant. It requires an ability to move, sufficient dispersal rate, and it also requires a pathway that allows you to move from one place to the other. So neither of those is guaranteed for any particular species. And the third option is basically don't do either of these. And the consequence will be extinction, at least extinction of that population. Okay, so first question, so that we can focus on migration, the second option. First option was stay in place and evolve. And a big question is, do species have the necessary genetic variation within current populations to exercise this option, to stay in place and adapt? Mutation is a very slow process. So basically, what we're asking is, do they already have the genes that will allow them to deal with an environment that they've never dealt with before, they've never experienced before? It's a tough ask. And we would expect that if they haven't faced higher temperature environment before, there's no reason for them to have genes that allow them to do well under that environment. We'll take an example, two things that probably don't have a big probability of being able to move to become climate migrants, or they would move particularly slowly, and these are turtles. So in Wisconsin, in Wisconsin, these are the populations of snapping and or Blanding's turtle that were sampled. The snapping turtle is a habitat generalist. That gives it a better chance of having some of the genes necessary in at least some of the populations, and they mature early. So generation time small, short, which means that evolutionary potential is probably greater. The other is Blanding's turtle, which is a habitat specialist, and it takes a long time to become sexually mature. Okay, so we would expect more genetic variation in the snapping turtle populations than in Blanding's turtle. Bottom line was, for all of the populations of snapping turtles, there was no gene whose frequency was correlated with the temperature of the habitat. There was no evidence that that it had genes for adapting to different temperatures. Same thing for Blanding's turtle. The gene frequencies in this case were correlated with how many roads were nearby, but not with the temperature of the habitat. So bottom line, for these species and for basically everyone that's been looked at, the answer to the question at the top, do species have the necessary genetic variation to stay in place and adapt and evolve? The answer is no. It's not a surprise, given how rapid climate change is. Okay, so then we get to the second option, the one that's the focus of this talk, and that is move. Go to some new suitable area, which we'll call becoming a climate migrant. There are already lots of climate migrants on our planet. Things are moving around, and they're moving more often than not, but not always, in the direction that would be appropriate as a response to climate change. Most observed rain shifts are to either higher elevation or to higher latitude, so moving to cooler environments. Here's an example, 32 fish species in French rivers, okay, and 72% of them over the last 40 years have shifted their ranges higher elevation, which means upstream. If you're trying to follow a moving temperature in a stream, basically it's colder if you go upstream. So they're moving towards the headwaters. But there were 16% that shifted downstream to warmer temperatures, not at all clear why. Here's one that shifted quite well upstream. So it was sort of a good climate migrant. Here's one that shifted downstream. And it's not clear what traits are associated with the right or the wrong kind of shift. Closer to home in Wisconsin, there have been records kept of the presence, absence of lots of understory herbaceous plants, including the one shown here, and 80% of them have moved at least partly north since 1950. Here, each arrow is a species, and the start of the arrow is where it was in 1950. The tip of the arrow is where the center of the range is essentially today. And you can see that most of the arrows point at least partly north. They're not necessarily straight north, and there are some weird ones, weird species that are migrating south. But the real question is, are they following their climate in direction and in speed? Here are the climate shifts for all those same species. And what you can see, I think, quite clearly is that, yes, 80% have a northward component to their migration since 1950, but very few are tracking their climate movement well. So very few are following their climate shifts accurately. So we've got migrants, but they're sort of confused. In the eastern US, there's even more confusion among trees in terms of even which direction to migrate in. And it turns out that fewer tree species have migrated significantly north than significantly west. Okay, so only a third of tree species east of the Mississippi have been moving north, 45% have been moving west. Well, what we're interested in, each arrow is a species. What we're interested in here are the green arrows. Those are species that have moved significantly north. Very few of them move directly north. And in fact, many of them move farther west than north. So what we want to do, I guess, is take a look at the number and the length and the direction of those green arrows. Compare it to the significant westward shifts, which are the blue arrows in this one. And I think it's clear there are more blue arrows on the right-hand figure than green arrows on the left. And for whatever reason, trees, especially east of the Mississippi, are moving in a direction that really doesn't help them deal with climate change. There is some taxonomic variation. Conifers, so things that have cones, pines, firs, so on, have tended to shift north primarily. Things like white pine. Angiosperms, flowering trees like red maple, have tended to shift west. So it's clear again that we have fairly inefficient climate migrants among our eastern US tree species. It's also the case in Quebec that over the past 40 years, 16 major common tree species were followed over this time, and 10 of the 16 have moved north, including these three: white pine, gray birch, red oak. They are moving north. Sorry. And that fits with the general pattern that of all range shifts, of all climate migrants, most, but by no means all, a majority, but by no means all, are moving in the observed direction. A recent review of over 13,000 observed range shifts in altitude have concluded that at the upper edge of the range, so towards the top of the mountain, that range edge has moved upward for 2/3 of species, 65%, but for about a quarter of species, it's moved downward. So we have a majority migrating in the right direction, but it's by no means universal. Center of the range, it's 58% moving up, 41% moving down. Again, not a universal trend of moving in the quote right direction. And at the lower edge of the range, it's 49 and 31. So again, what we see across all elevations is, yeah, more species are moving in the right direction than the wrong direction, but there are a lot of species that are migrating poorly. What if we look at latitudinal shifts, not altitudinal? So we'll focus on shifts on land. And here was about 13,000 different studies at the cold range edge, so the northern part in the northern hemisphere, 61 moving in the right direction, 31% moving in the wrong direction. At the center of the range, 60 and 40 moving in the correct and wrong direction. And at the southern edge of the range, it's about 50-50. So we do have a lot of climate migrants. These are all kinds of species. We do have a lot of climate migrants on our planet, but they're not migrating necessarily even in the right direction. So many are moving in the right direction, in the expected direction, but many are not. If we summarize both altitudinal and latitudinal shifts that have been observed over the last 50 years or so, 60% basically are in the quote right direction for a climate migrant, and 35% are in the wrong direction. So it's not as if natural migration looks like it's going to be the solution for these species to a rapidly changing environment. It's important to point out that we don't really know yet enough about global patterns of climate migration among non-human species. Why? Because almost all of the documented range shifts, first of all, are for terrestrial species, and only 5% are for marine species. It's just a lot easier to monitor and detect range changes on land than in the ocean. And the information that we have suggests that marine species are actually migrating a lot faster than land-based species, about 6 times faster. And it does make sense in some ways, because there are way more obstacles, many human created, for dispersal on land than for dispersal in the water. So it's probably a consequence of the number of obstacles that have to be overcome. We also don't know much yet about the taxonomic pattern. So what species are moving better, what are moving worse? Because of these almost 30,000 studies, 84% are for terrestrial arthropods, mainly insects. Mainly insects, and in insects, mainly butterflies. Vascular plants are the focus of a lot of these studies, and birds are. And it also, almost all the studies are North America and Europe. Some in Australia, some in South Africa, but we really don't have a good idea what's happening globally. Okay, with that said, we can ask, okay, species have been moving, not necessarily in the right direction. What about climate? And there is a metric that's been generated recently called climate velocity, or velocity of climate change. And it's basically asking, usually it's temperature based. So it's basically asking the temperature that was here a decade ago, how far did it move? And so the velocity of climate change is generally expressed as kilometers per decade. Here are the climate velocities measured on land. And the darker it is, the faster the climate is moving. And the faster species would have to move to migrate to keep up with it. There's quite a bit of variation. The eastern part of the US climate is moving faster north than the western part of the US. But the places on Earth that are where climate is moving the fastest and where species would have to chase a very rapidly moving climate are the high northern latitudes. There's an awful lot of Africa and the Amazon that falls into this category too. This is the same idea, but in oceans instead of land. I always have a hard time kind of understanding these maps where land is white and the ocean is. So anyway, bottom line is you can see there's quite a bit of movement of climate, of temperature isotherm in the ocean. The areas of highest climate velocity are, as for on land, the high northern latitudes, but the ocean climate velocity is also greatest at the equator. So equatorial species and polar species are going to have to be moving really fast to stay with their current climate. The average climate velocity on land is 14 kilometers per decade. In the ocean, it's almost double that, 27 kilometers per decade. Okay, if you're capable of self-propulsion, if you can swim, maybe 27 kilometers a decade is not a problem. If you float with the currents, if you're a phytoplankton, for instance, or a zooplankton that basically goes where the current takes you, then that's probably an impossible rate to match, let alone difficult direction. Okay, so we can ask then, are climate migrants today moving fast enough? We've already suggested maybe not. Are they moving fast enough to stay connected to the climate that they've inhabited for centuries? And we can look again at those understory species in Wisconsin. We talked about the direction of species shifts and climate shifts being not incredibly well correlated. But if we look at the rate of movement, the range shifts, the climate migration is only about half as fast as the climate shifts. So species are falling behind their climates. The question is, will they lose touch? And if so, what happens to them? Okay, so we talked about the species in Quebec, tree species. And again, the average shift, okay, 10 out of 16, that's not a bad percentage. But 8 of the 10 that are moving in the right direction are moving less than half as fast as they need to. There are only 2 species that are moving as fast as their climates, and those are basswood and big-tooth aspen. Nobody really has a good handle on what makes a tree a good climate migrant or not a very good one. It's not simply seed size, and it's not dispersal mechanism. If we look at movement, altitudinal movement, look in the Canadian Rockies, for instance, the climate has moved upslope about 140 meters since 1900. And here are some alpine tree species. They've moved upslope over that same time, but only 55 meters on average. So their migration isn't fast enough. It was only 40% of what was needed to keep in the same climate that they've inhabited for centuries. And if we look at altitudinal migration of birds in Peru, for instance, so the montane climate, the mountain climate in this area of Peru has moved upslope about 150 meters over the last 40 years. So censuses were taken at these 5 sites, ranging in elevation from basically 700 to 2,200 meters. Here are some of the species that were included in these studies. I don't expect anybody to know them. So they've moved upslope, but not the same amount. The chestnut-capped brush finch has moved up 160 meters over that 40-year period. That's pretty good. It's keeping touch with its climate. This one, the bluish flower piercer, is only moving up about half as fast as climate. And who knows what's going on with the orange-bellied euphonia. It's going in the wrong direction. Of course, winged things can move fast. They can migrate fast. But it doesn't do a bird any good to move fast if other things in its community that it requires don't move fast. Okay, if it requires certain prey items or certain tree species for nesting, it doesn't really help it to fly ahead of those. Okay, so on average, there's a lot of variation, but on average over this 40-year period, the birds in this study moved upslope about 50 meters. So I've rounded a little bit, but the percentages, they're moving up about a third as fast as they need to. In the future, climate velocity is going to increase. No question about it. How much it will increase depends on our choices about emissions. It depends on which emissions scenario we follow. Currently, we're emitting greenhouse gases at a rate that would produce something close to 4.5 degrees Celsius warming relative to pre-industrial. The scientific community has pushed for reducing emissions in order to, by end of century, cause no more than 1.5 degrees of warming. That's almost certainly not going to happen, but let's see how temperature would play out over the century. The date will be here, and this is change in temperature. So it's temperature change over basically the 21st century. So here, this is now. And if we continue to emit greenhouse gases at the current rate, you can see that the rate at which climate will change and the rate at which climate that existed in one given area will move, both are going to increase quite a bit. So climate velocity is going to increase. It's a bigger challenge for things that are either currently or will in the future be climate migrants. Some species don't even have that choice because there isn't going to be any suitable habitat to migrate to in the future. So we can think, for instance, of species that require ice. Sea ice in particular is disappearing. So The ice obligate polar bears and seals are, they really just don't have the opportunity to be a climate migrant. And yeah, and in the southern hemisphere, there are species, penguin species that, especially emperor penguins, that nest on sea ice as well, which is decreasing during the time that they nest. So these are species that may not have even the option of becoming climate migrants. Mountaintop species, species that are high elevation species. I mean, if you move a mountain, obviously, it only is so high, and you can only move so far up a mountain. As you do, generally, the area gets smaller and smaller. So mountaintop species eventually could run out of suitable habitat. If their habitat moves up and off the top of the mountain, they've been described as being on an escalator to extinction. And I think that is something that we have to worry about for all high elevation species. River species also at a certain point, may lose the ability to continue as a climate migrant. So for instance, we know that most of the French river fish species are moving upstream. What happens when they get to the headwaters? Now they don't have any place that they can migrate further to on their own. They can't get up and walk across the land. So river species in general can run into basically situations where there is nowhere left to go. Okay, so let's ask, how are the ranges of non-human migrants predicted to change in the future? Of course, it depends on our emission scenarios, our greenhouse gas emissions. That'll determine both how much suitable habitat there is in the future and where it is. So magnitude and location. Under the top panel is temperature change and precipitation change under more or less our current pathway, which we'll call business as usual, or sometimes called business as usual. The bottom panel are changes in temperature and precipitation under 2.2 degrees warming by end of century, and that's often referred to as the Paris Agreement future. Okay, so if suitable habitat exists, dispersal ability or migration ability is going to be crucial in determining whether a species will persist and generally the fate of the species. How fast can they move? It's a big question. Well, if you've got wings, you can move very fast. There's no question that you could keep pace with a moving climate, but you're only as fast, really. The effective rate of your migration is going to be only as fast as the effective rate for the slowest species that you need to coexist with. If you can move, but species you need cannot, the increased dispersibility doesn't do you a lot of good. And we have lots of species that can't move very fast. Okay, if you're a tree and you've got a big heavy seed, almost certainly acorns are not going to move very fast. We don't know much about fungi, but we know that there's quite a bit of variation and a lot of species that just aren't equipped with traits that would make them good climate migrants. And they're facing a tougher set of obstacles than any species than has ever been the case on our planet. Okay, for instance, here's Michigan before European settlers. Green is vegetated, mainly forest. Okay, if you're a forest understory species or you're a forest species, that's not a terribly hard landscape to migrate across. Might get a little tough when you get up to the straits, but at least it's not very hard. What was the first thing that European settlers did? Cut down the forest and use that instead as agricultural. Okay, if you're a forest understory plant, this is not an easy landscape to disperse, to migrate across. And then, of course, we've put in major roads and county roads, and you get the idea that this is a challenging landscape for climate migrants. So take a look at a couple examples. Post oak is a southern species, but climate, or what are called species distribution models, predict that under quite a range of emission scenarios, most or all of Michigan is predicted to be suitable habitat by 2100. Okay, here's the current range of post oak, and the darker the color, the more abundant it is. Here's the predicted distribution of post oak if we allow 2.2 degrees warming, and it's up in southern Michigan. It's definitely in Kalamazoo. With 4.5 degrees warming, it will have suitable habitat up through the upper peninsula. The question is, how much of that suitable habitat will it be able to migrate to? So if it can reach most or all of its future suitable habitat, it's going to be a really successful climate migrant. But if you include historical dispersal rates, which, remember, it's an oak, so it disperses as an acorn. And so the dispersal rates are actually quite low, 20 miles or so per century. Bottom line is, it's not going to get to most of its future suitable habitat. Here is its current range, now in white. Its future suitable range that isn't yet suitable but will become is all of this colored stuff. The green is highly suitable and so on. Okay, if we invoke these dispersal limits, then the color here indicates areas that it may colonize. Definitely not in, certainly not in most of Michigan. But the colors that we're interested in here are the areas that have it has a high probability of reaching, 80 to 100% chance of reaching, and it's almost none of its future suitable habitat. You can see some here, a little bit here, but it's very unlikely to reach almost all of its future suitable habitat. So for instance, under 4.5 degrees warming, it's predicted to be able to get to only 2% of the habitat that will become suitable in the future. It's not going to be a successful climate migrant. Maybe you're thinking, could we move it? And answer, yes, that'll be the last thing we talk about. There are a lot of other species that are predicted to be slow enough climate migrants that they're going to lag behind their moving climates. Here are two examples: southern red oak, sweet gum, current habitat in green. Okay, so they're southern species. And then future suitable habitat in yellow. It's quite a bit. I mean, for sweet gum, it goes up into Maine, actually also for southern red oak. Those colors represent places that it is likely to reach, to be able to migrate to within the time frame shown here. So what you look for is blue on these maps. How much blue is there? The answer is very little. Okay, it again will be able to migrate to very little of its future suitable habitat. So again, a climate dispersal, a set of climate migrants that are likely to be ineffective where climate migration is. Canadian trees, I'll go over this quickly. They're also predicted to fall behind their moving climates, and by a lot. So under 2.2 degrees warming, red maple is predicted to fall 550 miles behind its climate. paper birds, well, you can read the numbers, and they aren't much, the lags are not much higher under 4.5 degrees warming. So there are serious challenges, even under the Paris Agreement. There are, across many taxa, there is evidence that non-native species are better climate migrants than native species. And what we want to look at here is the spread of native versus non-native. And this is human transported, so we won't worry about that for now. On these graphs, the dotted line is the expected climate velocity throughout this century. And for lots of different species, mammals, birds, fish, insects, crustacean, gastropod, dicot, and monocot, basically native species are predicted to disperse more slowly than their climate. Very few categories have species that will keep up with the climate. Introduced species, non-natives, all groups are predicted to move faster than necessary. So non-natives certainly look like they will have an advantage over native species. So can we help the ones that are not good enough climate migrants on their own, if they're not able to migrate fast enough? And the phenomenon or the practice we're talking about is assisted migration, which is intentionally establishing populations in habitat that's suitable, but it's beyond where they live today. So it's beyond the boundary of the species range currently. Introducing wolves into Yellowstone is an example, but most of the examples of assisted migration today are trees. And the forestry services in the US and Canada have been very active in pursuing this. Bottom line is, if you take oak, several kinds of oak from Tennessee or Pennsylvania, which is where they currently exist, move them up to the northern end of their range, they do pretty well. So you can actually do within species assisted migration. And as long as you land them in what is currently part of their habitat, white oak seedlings do well if they come from Tennessee and you move them up to Ontario. Not so. So within a species range, assisted migration is more likely to be successful. Not so much if you're taking species from and putting them outside their range. So Tennessee blackjack oak, they survive, but they don't do as well in Ontario. Basically, they are much more susceptible to freeze damage. Not surprising. The last example has to do with a charismatic species, monarch butterflies. As you almost certainly know, most populations in the eastern US overwinter in Mexico in a very few, very restricted areas in Mexico by their choice. And the areas have to have this tree, which is called sacred fir. So here are the monarchs arriving for their overwintering grounds. The trees can be covered with them. These are really important sites for monarchs. If they disappear, monarchs disappear. Doesn't matter how good Michigan is. Okay, so it turns out that some of those sites where they currently overwinter, and there are really only about a dozen of them, some are becoming too hot. There's the more lowland sites, and there's a lot of mortality during the winter of the monarchs. So assisted migration is being attempted. Seedlings of the sacred fir are being planted at higher altitudes where the temperature maybe used to be too cold, but it's not anymore. They're doing okay up there. The problem is, what about the butterflies? Are they going to be able to find these new habitats of sacred fir created by assisted migration? Don't know. That's one of the many questions with assisted migration. If you were going to choose, one thing I'll just go through this quickly because it's an important idea that maybe has occurred to some of you. If you're choosing a site for assisted migration of sacred fir, where do you want to put it? And one of the big questions is what's in the soil. So it's not just nutrients in the soil, but an essential component of a successful assisted migration might be that it has to have the right fungi in the soil that are mycorrhizal fungi. They will help sacred fir extract nutrients from the soil. And if they're not there, everything else might be good, but the tree won't make it. There are some species for which there's going to be no option but assisted migration, something like the Sahara oryx. Okay, here's its current range. With 4-degree warming, almost all of the current range becomes unsuitable. But down in southern Africa, there's new suitable area. How does it get there? It cannot walk there. Okay, it has to be brought. Will it be a successful assisted migration? We don't know. Okay, bottom line, what I would get from, what I hope you get from this talk is that both on land and in the oceans, climates are moving poleward and to higher elevations. Some of the non-human climate migrants are moving in the right direction, but a lot are not even doing that. Very few non-human climate migrants are moving fast enough to keep pace with their moving climate. And the climate velocity, the rate of movement is going to increase. So it's really hard. And for me, that leads to the conclusion that to avoid extinction, many species are going to require us to intervene via assisted migration. We are by no means very good at it yet. We don't know what makes a suitable habitat. There are an awful lot of variables, and we haven't identified most of them. So, but I think we're going to have to get in the migration business, especially for endangered, range restricted species. If you think about it, everything that's in a nature preserve, that nature preserve is surrounded by unsuitable habitat, probably in many cases. So the species that we've already put a lot of effort into preserving probably are going to need us to get involved in a different way in the future. Okay, thank you.
Go for your questions, Steve.
Yeah, Dave, thanks. Thanks for all that. About assisted migration, one could imagine a scenario where, you find a suitable habitat, but there are other species that already live there. And, so we have to make some decisions. Are there, either existing or suggested guidelines for sort of navigating that space, or is this going to be, Wild West?
Not that I know of. Okay. Like I said, the Canadian and US Forest Service have done a lot of assisted migration for commercially valuable trees. They have some very broad guidelines, but nothing that says, okay, here's how you determine whether there are stronger competitors or whether there are herbivores that will eat it or whether there are pathogens that it's not experienced yet. So I think it's the abiotic conditions, including soil nutrients and so on, are pretty well known for commercially important tree species, but the biotic interactions are not. And there's no accepted method for trying to figure out what they are. Absolutely.
Tom?
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Dave. This is wonderful. As a natural landscaper with an advocate and a practitioner, I don't see much here which causes me to change my practice very much. And my practice would be to plant as wide a range of native plants from a more or less viable ecoregion where they are within their native range and hope for the best.
Yeah, I agree. I agree, Tom. I don't think that this talk suggests anything that you should do differently or anyone in Wildlands should do differently. I think what will become more available in the future is information about where the seeds came from. And probably a good idea when you plant to plant, like you said, from a similar ecoregion, but maybe south of us here. So, if you could get seeds from 200 miles south, they probably would do well now, and they'd probably do much better in the future. That's my guess. I get asked a lot, what trees should I plant in my yard? And it really depends on what seed sources are available.
Yeah, and your say 200-mile range, or in some cases even greater than that.
Yeah, I'm guessing.
Very selectively.
Yeah, nobody has it.
That makes a lot of sense to me. Thank you.
Yeah, just south, but not 10 miles south, as you know, 100 or several hundred miles. I would say.
I'd like
Rebecca?
to say something to that. When last year, when the Nature Center was planting some new trees, and Jenny might speak more to this, but they did bring in trees from, I believe she said it was Indiana, the southern portion of the range, that they were then planting into the KNC, so that it would be trying to bring in new blood, so to speak.
And same species. The
Right.
species occurs here, but they're, I mean, the oak study with transplanting from Tennessee to, southern Ontario says for a lot of species, should be able to do that. You can take southern individuals or seeds from southern populations, and they'll probably be able to do okay at least within the current range, north part. But
Rebecca,
I think assisted migration is going to be a repeated process. Sorry, Rebecca.
You have a question?
Hi, David.
Hi.
Thanks for that. I just really wanted to say thank you because I'll be using it with my students here. I'm at the Kalamazoo Area Math and Science Center, and I know you've been a mentor to students here before. So I'm going to use your video when that's posted,
Cool.
and I think it'll give them sort of the broad framework, but then I appreciate how you tied it to specific species, specific studies. So I
Great.
appreciate that. And then I didn't check at the end. Are there any like references in your slides, or would it be possible to kind of get
Absolutely
shortcut them to some of those studies?
Yeah, in the area that you can't see at the bottom of each slide, where you make your notes, all of the original sources are in there. So I don't put them in the slides because it gets sort of messy, in my opinion. But I'm happy to send you all of the papers that were cited.
I think I'll have students who are interested in looking into this. So thank you.
Tell them they're encouraged to get in touch with me if they have any questions.
Thanks.
Tom, I think you were next. Hackley.
Okay. Well, this is probably opening up a whole can of worms, David, but you didn't mention anything about food crops, which seems like a fairly critical thing for human survival. And do you have any comments about that?
I think food crops are going to be a target of assisted migration efforts no matter what. I mean, if Kansas becomes too hot and dry to grow corn, then either we'll try to develop new corn strains that can deal with that, or more likely we're going to start growing corn north of where we do now. Canada, actually, the Corn Belt is predicted to move up into Canada by well before the end of the century. So I think that I think there already is fairly active experimentation with new habitat suitability for agriculturally important crops. One of the problems is, if you're a subsistence farmer in sub-Saharan Africa, you're not likely to be an integral participant in assisted migration studies or practices. So it's something that I think, like so many climate-related issues, is very different for Europe, Western Europe and North America versus the rest of the world. Going to be really important if you eat only what you grow. But yeah, I think, Tom, that's going to be, I think it already is probably the subject of a lot of research by the agricultural corporations.
Tim.
Going back to Steve's question, it occurred to me to wonder if it makes more sense to talk about ecosystem migration rather than species migration.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a great question, Tim. I mean, that's the real challenge. How do you move something to a new place that has some of the characteristics that it survives in, but you don't know about many of them. So other species that are required. Something like, if you want to move an endangered flowering plant, how do you get the pollinator to be there? If it's, specialist mutualisms are a real challenge. You can't, it's an obvious case where you can't move just one species. But how do you move in the ecosystem? How do you move a community? I don't know. I mean, for sure, you want to bring, if it's a plant, you want to bring some of the soil. If for many reasons, but in particular because of the mutualistic mycorrhizal fungi it'll have.
If I may, I have another question, which is, does it make any sense to talk about a world in which there was 4.5 degrees warming?
Does it make any sense to talk about that? Absolutely.
Because the consequences would be so universal and terrible and catastrophic.
Yeah, I don't think that makes it an impossibility. In fact, everything I know, and I assume you and many people on the screen now know, says that's pretty much the future we're headed for. I mean, somewhere between 3 and 5 degrees warming. We could avoid that. We could do much, much better, but not if we elect people like Trump. I mean, that's sending us backwards by a fair margin. So I think it is possible, especially if we figure out how to pull carbon dioxide out of the air, so we could actually lower atmospheric CO2, which we'd have to do for a long time because it's going to keep coming out of the oceans. But I think by the time things get bad enough to make us say we need to do something, there's a good chance that it's already going to be too late. There are a number of feedbacks in Earth's climate system, most of which are positive, which mean that if you reach a certain level of warming, you are committed to a higher level of warming because these things will be self-reinforcing. Obviously, the melting of reflective ice and exposing non-reflective and therefore heat-absorbing surfaces underneath is a clear positive feedback. So I don't know, Tim. I mean, greed is a really powerful motivation for many people. And greed, in this case, greed argues for continuing to use fossil fuels. Not everybody's, the greed of a few people.
Okay,
So
there's a
anyway, yeah, I think it's
question-
possible.
There's a question in chat, and that does the US pay attention and set land use change, and forestry goals like the EU does?
You may know better. I don't know of any, but you know, if you ask anybody, what's your favorite 20-year plan in the United States, like official government 20-year plan? Good luck. Yeah. There isn't any. We don't plan ahead like Europe does. So I don't know of any guidelines that official guidelines or protocols that people that the U.S. has envisioned for the next, for till mid-century or beyond. But we don't think that far ahead, typically.
And you're saying that if we did, then every administration could change them as they come in?
Yeah, if it was executive orders, for sure.
Okay.
I'd like to see a constitutional amendment that says, "Thou shalt not jeopardize the planet for future generations." Good luck with that.
I did have sort of one question. I mean,
Sure.
when you were talking about, and you sort of answered it, because I was 20 years in Colorado, and so there was no climate velocity as you're talking about it, but there was definitely climate heightening, should I call it that, for going up a mountain?
Yeah.
And so when you were showing that one map of the climate velocity where there was no velocity, it was all mountain regions. It was the Andes in the south, it was the Rockies, but the Appalachians had climate velocity.
Oh, yeah. All mountains do.
But yeah, so, but apparently the higher ones, like the Andes and the Rockies, must have less because it goes up instead of.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
So climate velocity on high elevation areas is actually quite high.
Oh, yeah. No.
But it's
Yeah,
almost always expressed as latitudinal movement, horizontal movement. Climate, the species that are at highest elevations are experiencing the greatest rate of change to their current habitats, but it doesn't show up on a two-dimensional map. So yeah, you're right, Nikki. The montane species everywhere are in serious trouble, I think, except the very widespread ones.
Yeah, they're saying the marmots have gone as high as they can.
Yeah, there's a number of species in Peru that are considered ridgetop specialists that in several sampling sites have disappeared. And almost certainly, in my opinion, almost certainly because their climate ran away from them and they couldn't follow. But if you think about, I mean, species that are in reserves, nature reserves all over the place, all over the world, they're allowed to be there, but they're not allowed to be out of there in many cases. And so regardless of their dispersal ability, their migration ability, if they don't have a pathway, if they don't have a corridor to future suitable habitat, doesn't really matter how fast they can move. But I think for many of the charismatic species, or for many of the species that have been the focus of conservation efforts, there's going to be a lot of attempt to move them to new places. But you know, whose land are you going to take to make the new Yellowstone?
But thank you all for being here today. And
Yes,
as I said,
thank
I
you.
was really happy that there was a teacher here with her classroom. I thought that was great.
Yeah, and thank you for the questions.
Yeah.
I can't convince my grad students of this, but I always consider the questions after a talk as the main reward for giving a talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.